The movie opens up by the man named Basil Brown. He was an archaeologist of ancient historical objects. One afternoon, Brown was on a boat trip to a rural island in England. Upon arrival, he immediately rode a bicycle to visit the house of someone respected in that area named Mrs. Pretty. She was a wealthy widow with one kid. Her husband was a military general who died during World War I. Mrs. Pretty called Brown to ask for help digging up mysterious hills on her land which she believed must have historical relics. When Brown saw the condition of the land and did an analysis, he assumed that there must be a buried historical relic from the Viking civilization. When discussing the matter at Mrs. Pretty's place, Brown asked her to hire 2 more people to help him dig the relic so that the work could be finished quicker. In the middle of the conversation, Mrs. Pretty's child named Robert, who also loved archaeology, immediately became acquainted with Brown. The next day, the excavation project started. Day after day, Brown and the other 2 diggers kept trying to dig up the hill until they finally found a piece of weathered wood. Not long after, 2 delegates from the city museum came. Both of them were shocked to see the relic that Brown found. When one of the delegates helped to lift the findings, the wood accidentally snapped into 2. In frustration, Brown went away to calm down. At Mrs. Pretty's house, the 2 guests from the city museum were welcomed. When Brown came, he told Mrs. Pretty that his analysis had been wrong. Based on the weathering level of the wood, he was sure that it must be much older than the Viking civilization, namely the Anglo-Saxon civilization. Hearing Brown's analysis, the 2 museum delegations laughed, saying that it was impossible since there were no archaeologists in England that had ever found historical relics before the Viking civilization. Rather than digging the ground here without assurance about the findings, they offered Brown to help them with the excavation project in another place, but because he didn't want to disappoint Mrs. Pretty, Brown refused the offer. The next day, as usual, every month Mrs. Pretty always visited her husband's grave. After coming home from the cemetery, she was seen holding pain in her chest. Not long after, a doctor came to check her condition. After the exam, the doctor gave a list of medications and told Mrs. Pretty to keep herself from overthinking. The next day, Mrs. Pretty checked the excavation project. Since the condition of the excavation was unstable, Brown forbade Mrs. Pretty to get too close, but when Brown explained the results of his latest analysis, suddenly, the ground nearby collapsed and almost buried Brown. Luckily, Brown survived the incident. For days, Brown and his 2 assistants continued digging the hills. One day, while at work, Robert came to play. In the middle of a chat, suddenly 4 British combat planes passed. That time was years before World War II began. Soldiers in various countries were busy preparing for war. Robert said that when he grew up, he didn't want to be a soldier like his father, but he wanted to be an astronaut so he could visit the stars. Brown then said that he often sees stars through a telescope. If Robert wanted, then he would bring his telescope there. Hearing that, Robert was very happy and asked Brown to keep his promise. 3 days later, Brown took Mrs. Pretty and Robert to the excavation site where he surprised them with his newest findings. There, they found a historical relic in the form of a boat. They were all filled with joy and congratulated each other on this great discovery. In the afternoon, after a day of digging, Mrs. Pretty's maid informed him that a guest was waiting in the room. During the excavation project, Mrs. Pretty facilitated Brown with a room. When he entered the room, it turned out that the guest was his wife, May. She went there just to see how her husband was doing because there had been no news from him for weeks. The 2 of them then spent their time walking around Mrs. Pretty's house. May then went back home in the evening. That night, it was raining heavily. In the middle of heavy rain, while trying to save his findings from the water that flooded the hole, Brown almost slipped. Luckily, Mrs. Pretty's cousin named Rory arrived on time to help Brown out. While taking shelter, Rory introduced himself and explained that he was there because Mrs. Pretty asked him to help with the excavation project and to take documentation photos about it. At the hospital in London, after undergoing a doctor's examination, the doctor diagnosed that Mrs. Pretty's heart disease was getting worse. It turned out that Mrs. Pretty had been suffering from chronic heart disease. The doctor even sentenced her that she wouldn't make it long. In the afternoon, at the excavation site, the delegations of the National Museum came. When they saw the boat relic that Brown found, everyone was amazed. One of the delegations named Phillips arrogantly said that Brown had done a great job and that his job there was enough. From there, on behalf of the country, he would take over the excavation project. Hearing that, Brown couldn't say anything but accepted the decision. Brown then proceeded to confirm what happened to Mrs. Pretty. When he was about to meet her, Mrs. Pretty's servant forbade him to enter the house because Mrs. Pretty couldn't be bothered at that moment. Instead of leaving, Brown entered the house through the side door. When he met Mrs. Pretty, Brown asked what the officer said that made Mrs. Pretty, who had wanted to finish this project herself, suddenly handed it over to the state. Since Mrs. Pretty's bad condition, she asked her servant to ask Brown to leave. The next day, since Phillips was the head of the project now, he said that if Brown still wanted to work, he could help the excavation process but without touching the boat again. Brown, who didn't accept it, preferred to stop and left. On the way home, he met Robert. When Robert asked where he was going, Brown sadly replied that he was leaving for home and would not come back there again since he quitted from the excavation project. Robert then hurriedly took the bike and chased him. When he got home, Brown told his wife the reason for quitting the project. He felt that if he continued working, he wouldn't be considered the inventor of the relic. May approached him and said what Brown always said was that an archaeologist did not serve for reputation, but to show people the past and to help them learn about the lives of their ancestors. Hearing it, Brown was silenced. In the middle of the conversation, Brown was surprised to see Robert following him all the way across the island on a bicycle. Robert there asked for Brown's promise to see the stars together through his telescope. Brown then invited the boy to come in. Not long after, Mrs. Pretty came to pick Robert up after reading the letter from Brown. Not only that, but she also wanted to ask Brown to come back for the project the next day. What Brown's wife said earlier made him contemplate his decision and decided to come back for the project. The next morning, Brown returned to work there as well as 2 new young archaeologists to help with excavations. Unlike before, this time, Mrs. Pretty was more active in supervising the project. At night, Brown kept his promise to show the stars to Robert through his telescope. Robert was so happy that he invited his mother to come to see the stars together. A few days later, when everyone was busy digging, one of the diggers managed to find a hidden treasure from the boat.
Where did you find it, darling?
There's more. There's much more.
Can't be. The ship is older.
Brown's analysis was right. The beat was from the Anglo-Saxon era. Philip was so surprised with the findings. He never thought that there were some cultures already in the Dark Ages. They even had some kind of trading instrument. Phillips believed that this discovery would definitely make a big change in the way people see the past nowadays. After a long day collecting all the relics, Phillips ordered the workers to put them in the car to be taken to the museum, but Mrs. Pretty refused because all the objects were found on her land. Considered the inventor of the boat, Mrs. Pretty was the one who has the right to decide where the historical objects will be kept. Mrs. Pretty then ordered Brown to bring all the treasures found to her house. The next day, when everyone was continuing excavation, suddenly a British fighter plane crashed.
Tidal, the current is fierce.
Rory rushed to help, but the pilot couldn't be saved. At night, inside Mrs. Pretty's house, she suddenly collapsed. One of the female workers immediately took her to her room. Despite being in great pain, Mrs. Pretty refused to call the doctor. Robert, who accidentally saw and heard his mother grimacing in pain, immediately ran away. Outside, he bumped into Brown. Robert cried and was mad at himself at the same time for feeling like a failure. Since his father died, as the only son, everyone expected him to be able to take care of his mother. Robert then told Brown about his mother's heart disease, which he overheard a few days ago when a doctor checked on his mother in the house. He also knew his mother would not make it long. Brown was shocked to hear that. Even though he wanted to help, there was nothing he could do about it. He was just a stranger who shouldn't interfere in other people's family matters. Brown could only calm him down and then told him to go back to sleep. In the bar, while Phillips and the diggers were enjoying the music on the radio bar, shocking news suddenly interfered. It was stated that Germany had just bombarded Poland. In the morning, Rory said goodbye to Mrs. Pretty. When Mrs. Pretty asked, Rory said that he was selected to serve in the military to defend the country and join the battlefield. When she heard that, Mrs. Pretty was shocked. She asked Rory to promise to come back safely. She thought that he would be the only relative that Robert had when she died later. The next day, on a trial, the judge stated that the boat relic completely belonged to Mrs. Pretty. In the car, instead of being happy, Mrs. Pretty cried about her health condition and that she wouldn't be alive for long. Mrs. Pretty then asked Brown about what the Anglo-Saxon civilizations believed about death, where the spirit of the dead would venture after life. Brown replied that the Anglo-Saxons were a sailor civilization who spent most of their lifetime sailing all over the world. They believed that the end of their voyage was towards the stars in the sky. They also believed that after their death, the spirits would fly to the stars to complete their wanderings. To celebrate her winning in the trial before, Mrs. Pretty invited many people, including the family of the diggers from the project. In her speech, Mrs. Pretty announced in front of all guests, including the journalists, that Brown was the first person who discovered the historic boat relic. Brown was touched by Mrs. Pretty's appreciation of his work on the excavation project. After the event, Mrs. Pretty invited Brown to the excavation site where the boat was found. There, Mrs. Pretty said that she would hand over the treasures found on the boat to the National Museum as a gift so that more people could see them. Hearing the decision, Brown agreed and suggested burying the boat back to maintain its current condition, considering that the World War was about to start. The Germans would definitely bombard England, and in order to keep it from being destroyed, burying it might be the best option they had. The night before the burial project, Robert took his mother to the boat and imagined that he was the captain that would take his queen sailing to the stars. Despite knowing that her mother wouldn't live much longer, he tried to hold back his tears. From behind, Brown accompanied them both that night. Under the night sky, Robert and his mother spent time together as if it was their last night.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state